Hola, buenas tardes, buenas noches. Michael, qué placer estar aquí, qué placer que para hablar con uno de los grandes pensadores, una de las personas que reflexiona sobre la política, sobre la sociedad, sobre el bien común, sobre lo que significa estar unidos y conectados, sobre el poder de la conversación, haya conseguido reunir a tanta gente esta tarde en Madrid, esta noche en este escenario y en este maravilloso festival de las ideas del que estáis disfrutando. Si estáis aquí es porque sabéis quién es Michael Sandel, es profesor de Harvard, es filósofo, es un hombre inquieto, autor de muchos libros que nos explican quiénes somos y dónde estamos en el mundo, pero yo lo que acabo de descubrir hace unos minutos, hablando con él antes de entrar en este escenario, es que quiso ser periodista político. Cubrió una parte muy importante del Watergate. Y yo tengo la sensación, Michael, que esa pequeña parte de tu biografía, tú eras muy joven, estudiante en Washington, de alguna forma, aunque tu carrera fuera luego hacia la filosofía, ha cambiado tu manera de ver la realidad y de ver el mundo. Dime que sí, porque los periodistas necesitamos también un poco de apoyo y de cariño.
Yes.
Bien.
But let me also, first of all, thank you, Montserrat, for this conversation and say how impressive I find this entire festival, and to thank the people who organized it. Because, Montserrat, when people hear about philosophy, they think that philosophy resides in the heavens,
Yes,
or in the clouds, far beyond the world in which we live. I believe philosophy belongs in the city, where citizens gather in public places like Plaza de España, and that's what we're doing here tonight, where people gather from different backgrounds with different opinions, to reason together, to think together, sometimes to argue and debate together about big questions that matter. That's what philosophy is for. That's why philosophy belongs where citizens gather in places like this, rather than in entirely remote abstractions beyond the world.
es la cuna de la democracia.
Yes.
El ágora, el lugar, el espacio, y muy dentro de la tradición socrática que Michael Sandel defiende, que es a través de escuchar al contrario, de escuchar a la otra persona, de debatir en público cómo se va conformando esa visión del mundo, no a través de una toga y de un discurso o de un monólogo.
Right, exactly. In fact, the beginning of philosophy in the Western tradition, Socrates did not give lectures. He didn't stand at a podium with students writing notes. He didn't even write books. He wandered the streets of the city. He went down to the port. He spoke to the workers on the docks in the port. And he asked questions that led people to reflect on the lives they lived individually and also together in political community. That's how philosophy was born, and I think it's that energy and that spirit of inquiry that democracy needs to flourish, and we're not doing very well at that today.
¿Por qué?
Well, we could begin with the poverty, the empty terms of public discourse today. I think that citizens in democracies around the world are frustrated with politics and with the hollowness, the emptiness of public debate. What passes for political discourse these days consists either of narrow technocratic talk, which inspires no one, or where passion enters, we have shouting matches, where partisans shout past one another without really listening. I think there is a great hunger among citizens for something better. People want public life to be about big questions, such as, what is a just society? What should be the role of money and markets in a good society? What do we owe one another as fellow citizens? Big questions like these, and of course, like the biggest debate I've learned about in Spain, the tortilla debate, con cebolla o sin cebolla.
Eso es básico para empezar. Pero, profesor, yo tengo una percepción que me inquieta mucho, y es que hay una voluntad deliberada en que nos gritemos y no nos escuchemos. En la forma de desautorizar a la política, el debate público, el discurso de los ciudadanos, el denigrar la política, denigrar las instituciones, castigar al que no piensa como tú, creo que hay, no sé si una intención malévola, pero desde luego que a mí no me parece clara, en desacreditar los sistemas democráticos. Hay una especie de interés o de nostalgia, desde mi punto de vista, por esas figuras fuertes que tienen la razón, que saben liderar al pueblo, y no este barullo, este ruido, los que te dicen cómo tienes que comerte la tortilla, con o sin cebolla. Y si eres de los de con cebolla, no puedes entenderte con los que la toman sin cebolla. Y creo que hay ahí un problema que se fomenta esa desconfianza y se acaba desconfiando de todo el discurso público, de toda la fuerza de la democracia.
Yes. There are political figures and political movements that do have an interest deliberately in deepening the distrust that many people have of democratic institutions and of politics. So I agree, there is something, it's a way of exploiting sources of discontent and mistrust that are already present, but deepening the discontent and mistrust for political advantage, and we've seen it very powerfully in democracies around the world. But I would add, so these political figures who are manipulating the distrust bear a lot of responsibility for the peril that democracy faces. But I would identify another source of the mistrust, which created space for demagogic figures to heighten the discontent and the sense of grievance and to exploit it. Because they are working with some legitimate grievances that many working people have, working people especially, against elites. Because if we think back 4 or 5 decades to the era of neoliberal globalization, this era of a kind of market-driven globalization was brought about, was promoted, was defended, was enacted by mainstream politicians and political parties across the center right and the center left. And you remember, it goes back at least to the 1980s. It began on the right with Ronald Reagan and Margaret Thatcher saying government is the problem and markets are the solution. But even after they were succeeded by center-left politicians and political parties, Bill Clinton in the United States, Tony Blair in Britain, Gerhard Schroeder in Germany, they moderated, they softened, but they never challenged this deep market faith. They never challenged the assumption that market mechanisms are the primary instruments for defining and achieving the public good. And so as a result, they promoted a market-driven version of globalization that crowded out democratic politics. And what they said was, they presented neoliberal globalization as if it were fact of nature beyond democratic control. Do you remember Bill Clinton said, globalization is not something we can hold back. It's like a force of nature, like water or wind. And Tony Blair said, he compared it to the unalterability of the seasons. He said there are those who say we should stop and debate globalization. They may as well say we should debate whether autumn should follow summer. So these arrangements, which led to widening inequalities, which led to great economic growth and rewards for those at the top, but left the bottom half of the population in most democracies with stagnant wages for 4 or 5 decades, with job losses due to outsourcing to low-wage countries. The benefits were not shared, and yet the system was presented as if it's not a political choice, it's simply a way of adapting to the weather, to forces of nature. And that discredited politics and created legitimate grievances that the demagogues of the right-wing hyper-nationalist kind, they've exploited those grievances because they've said this was brought about by meritocratic elites, and we are going to help you get revenge against those elites. And so it created a toxic politics. But both the hyper-nationalists and the mainstream political figures who depicted the economy as beyond politics, both contributed to the toxic politics we have today.
Hay algo perverso, porque esa descripción, esa entronización de la globalización como esa fuerza de la naturaleza que era imparable, esa desregulación de los mercados, ese sistema en el que la productividad solo está basada en la productividad del dinero, que produjo la gran crisis económica de 2008, la gran recesión posterior, y toda esa pérdida de trabajo, de riqueza de la que mencionas, profesor, que todavía no nos hemos recuperado, ha acabado alimentando algo que legítimamente es preocupante, y es la sensación de que la dignidad del trabajo, la conciencia de que el trabajo era el asidero, no solamente el ascensor social, sino uno cuando tenía trabajo podía llegar a final de mes y podía aspirar a una vida mejor, legítimamente eso ya no existe. Nos pasa que en España hay muchas familias que a pesar de tener trabajo y tal, no llegan a final de mes, no pueden pagar una vivienda, no tienen claro que sus hijos vayan a poder. Y eso es legítimamente una fuente de descontento. ¿Qué tienen que hacer los políticos? Lo digo porque además estamos de cara a unas elecciones en Estados Unidos muy interesantes, pero estamos en ciclos electorales en Europa permanentes, con discursos muy peligrosos que señalan a la inmigración como la causa de esa falta de dignidad en el trabajo, y eso es algo de lo que el profesor Sandel ha escrito mucho, ¿no? De la importancia de que vuelva a ponerse el foco desde el discurso político en garantizar no solamente que la inflación esté controlada, sino que los salarios sean la forma de ganarse la vida decentemente. ¿Cómo conseguimos que ese discurso llegue a la política?
We have to begin, as you suggest, by shifting the terms of public debate to focus on the dignity of work. And that has to begin by acknowledging that work is not only a way of making a living, though it certainly is that, it's also a way of enabling people to contribute to the economy and to the common good, and to win recognition for doing so. And so part of the grievances that are exploited by right-wing populist figures are economic, addressing the frustrations of those left behind. But they are also about honor, recognition, and esteem. People feel that the work they do not only doesn't pay enough, doesn't pay what it's worth, but as a result, it's no longer a source of honor and respect and recognition by the wider society. At a time when hedge fund managers, or a figure like Elon Musk, make billions upon billions, people who are care workers, nurses, healthcare workers, teachers, people who make things with their hands, who may not have a university degree, but who provide important, useful contributions to the economy and to the common good, they've seen their wages, but also the honor and social self-esteem that goes with contribution, falling further and further behind. So I think there are three sources of the discontent that any democratic renewal has to address. One is the dignity of work. A second, and it goes closely along with it, is a sense of disempowerment. People feel that their voices don't matter, that what they think doesn't matter, that they have no meaningful say in shaping the forces that govern their lives. And that is what democracy is supposed to be about, giving people a sense that they have a meaningful say. So a sense of disempowerment and a loss of community. And with that goes a loss, the erosion of a sense of identity, of being situated, located in the world. And people feel that the moral fabric of community has been unraveling around them, from family to neighborhood to community to country. And when people feel both disempowered, well, when they feel disrespected, disempowered, and that they're no longer located in a world they can recognize, they look for victims. They look for, and they are open to political appeals that offer to reassert a kind of sense of collective sovereignty with a vengeance, which is what we get, which is why the immigration issue looms so large, why it works so powerfully for right-wing populist, hyper-nationalist politicians. Because the image that immigrants are coming into a country fits with people's sense that they no longer have a strong sense of community, that the society's obligation to citizens matters less than their obligation to outsiders. This is the appeal. This is the way in which the loss of community, which is a legitimate worry, is distorted by hyper-nationalists who use immigration very effectively. Immigration also taps into the sense of disempowerment. We can't control our borders. Even people who live in parts of the country, and this is true in the US, and I've heard it's true in Spain, who live far away from those parts of the country that have many immigrants, throughout Europe, still they feel deeply the threat of immigration, not because they know any immigrants or have been displaced themselves by any immigrants, but because it symbolizes this lack of control over national sovereignty. It symbolizes the disempowerment and the loss of community and ultimately the loss of respect. So I think that responsible political parties have to respond to these legitimate frustrations if they're to offer an alternative to the anti-immigrant, xenophobic, hyper-nationalist politics that is exploiting those legitimate grievances. And the mainstream parties have not been very good at doing this.
Claro. Se canaliza ese descontento, esa sensación de pérdida de identidad y de poder hacia un enemigo contra el cual es fácil dirigir los cañones. Los políticos tienen una responsabilidad, pero nosotros como ciudadanos, ¿qué podemos hacer? Yo te lo pregunto, profesor, desde la perspectiva de los medios de comunicación, porque, claro, nosotros fuimos durante muchos años los canalizadores de la opinión pública. Pecamos de mucha soberbia. Y tú citabas ahora a Elon Musk. Yo echo de menos el antiguo Twitter, porque era un foro de discusión, de descubrimiento. Por supuesto que había también insultos y malos modos, pero también era un lugar para encontrar ideas, para descubrir a gente interesante. Eso ha ido desapareciendo. Nosotros tenemos una responsabilidad como medios de comunicación, pero ¿qué podemos hacer los ciudadanos, ya no solamente los políticos, para esa idea del bien común, esa idea de defender nuestro sentido de pertenencia, el que trabajamos en unas sociedades que serán más justas para nosotros, para nuestros hijos y para los que vengan de fuera a cuidarnos? ¿Qué podemos hacer para reforzar esos lazos cuando los sindicatos, los lugares de ocio, cuando tantas cosas que hacían crecer las comunidades han desaparecido?
Well, we need to begin with what you just mentioned, Sarah. Recreating and strengthening and renewing within civil society class-mixing institutions, public places and common spaces that gather people together from different walks of life, from different social and economic backgrounds, in the course of their everyday lives. I'm thinking of, well, public places like this. I'm also thinking of less grand, less eventful settings in everyday life. Public parks, public swimming pools, public libraries, public transportation, where people, even sports stadia, that traditionally have brought people together to encounter one another almost inadvertently, not because they are seeking out a civic experience, but because the public parks or the public schools, most importantly, are places where they are bringing their children. They are going seeking out places of public recreation. And when they do so, they encounter people different from themselves. Now, public spaces have eroded in recent years. It's one of the most corrosive effects of the inequality, the growing inequality of income and wealth, is the loss of public places, because increasingly those who are affluent buy their way out of public schools and, let's say, public recreational facilities. Those who can enroll in a private health club no longer need to use the public swimming pool or the public park or recreational center. Those who can afford to send their kids to private schools no longer have a stake or feel they have a stake in the public schools. So the public realm as a gathering place begins to become eroded. So I think we need to renew public places. Democracy does not require perfect equality. But what it does require is that citizens from different backgrounds encounter one another, bump up against one another in the course of their everyday lives. Because this is how we learn to negotiate and to live with our differences, and this is how we come to care for the common good. So renewing class mixing institutions in public places is one important way. Another, and you mentioned the media, the traditional media, by contrast to social media. Social media has also contributed to the unraveling of shared experiences. When I was growing up, I was a news junkie. I loved politics, and I would watch, there were 3 national news broadcasts every evening, and I would try to watch all 3 of them. But people would it wasn't 24 hours, and it wasn't staring at a screen, scrolling every moment of the day, and being constantly inflamed and offended and enraged by the news feeds that were calculated by the social media companies to keep you glued to the screen. There's a perverse business model that depends on keeping us watching our screens for as long as possible so that the companies can gather more and more personal data, all for the sake of selling us stuff through targeted digital ads. That is a perverse business model that is corrosive of democracy, because it separates us into bubbles of like-minded opinion, and it encourages the most inflammatory, sensational form of ideological combat, and it destroys the possibility of reasoned public debate and disagreement. So what we need, first of all, I think, is greater regulation of these social media platforms. And here's one proposal, one concrete proposal. If the business model is at the heart of the problem, what about enacting a ban on targeted digital advertising, at least to children, and maybe also to adults, to force them to a different business model? Maybe they could sell their service by subscription, and they wouldn't need to keep us glued to the screen, for endless hours at a time. So we need to rein in that kind of social media platform. But we also need to find ways for the traditional media to reinvent and reimagine its role as a convener of public discourse. Now, you're doing that at SARE, and you're doing that beautifully. But there are too few of the traditional media outlets that are doing this very well or very seriously. So we need to challenge the enormous power that these social media companies have had for capturing and our attention and distracting us. And at the same time, find ways to strengthen and build traditional media that can provide forums for real disagreement and discussion and debate.
Me gusta muchísimo escucharle decir eso, profesor, porque es verdad, o sea, tenemos una responsabilidad y como ciudadanos señalaba 2 caminos. Hay una parte que está en cada uno de nosotros, que es saber qué leemos, saber con quién hablamos, qué discutimos, qué selección hacemos de lo que escuchamos, dónde acudimos, donde haya una información rigurosa y de calidad, lo cual recae sobre nuestros hombros como ciudadanos, y luego exigir a los políticos que tomen medidas para que las grandes corporaciones, las grandes tecnológicas, hagan un control de los contenidos, que paguen impuestos, por ejemplo, que eso es un debate aquí en Europa muy importante también, que toda esa riqueza no desaparezca, que crean, no desaparezca. Y sobre esto quería preguntarle también, la inteligencia artificial. Podemos ser tecnófobos y verla como una amenaza, o entender que va a cambiar y va a ayudar como lo está haciendo ya en la medicina, en el derecho, para conectarnos, para mejorar procesos productivos. Pero es verdad que hay una duda importante sobre esa dignidad del trabajo y sobre qué va a significar la inteligencia artificial en los puestos de trabajo y en la calidad de los puestos de trabajo. ¿Cómo debemos enfrentarnos a un cambio que intuimos que va a ser sustancial en los mercados de trabajo en todo el mundo?
I think you're right that artificial intelligence can play a constructive role. However, many people regard it as a threat because it seems that the first application of artificial intelligence, it seems that the most natural use of artificial intelligence is to replace work, to automate jobs so that robots can do more efficiently, more cost effectively what people do. Now, why do we assume that that is the best or the most important use for these remarkable new technologies? Well, one of the reasons we assume that, in a way, it goes back to the globalization era proponents saying it's just a force of nature and we have to adapt. We hear the same thing when we talk about technology. Technological innovation, AI, automation, this is happening. This is the wave of the future, and we had better figure out how to adapt to it. Well, is that exactly right? Does the direction of technology to replace jobs, for example, is that just given by nature? Or is that a choice that is enacted without any real public debate by those in Silicon Valley, for example, tech entrepreneurs who see that as the most profitable use for AI? But why should the use of this technology be decided by Silicon Valley venture capitalists rather than by democratic citizens asking, how can AI serve the common good? Now, it's because AI is largely the product of private investment, that those venture capitalists just assume we're going to use it to cut costs and to get rid of medium or low skilled or increasingly higher skilled jobs. But what about a public debate about what the direction of AI should be? It would require that it be backed by public investment. Although much technological innovation is already enabled and empowered by a lot of public investment, even when private companies profit from it. The COVID vaccines are one example of this. But in terms of AI, why not have a public debate about using AI to empower workers to be more productive so that they could, rather than be replaced, their productivity could be enhanced and their wages could reflect their enhanced productivity. That's a political choice. That's a question we could debate democratically about the future direction of technological innovation. And in a way, it's parallel to this false necessity about the way in which market-driven globalization would unfold.
Así que de nuevo tenemos el debate entre lo público y lo privado y no permitir que las verdades que defienden las grandes empresas como inamovibles, no dejar de cuestionarlas y no olvidar que hay un bien común, un bien social y un bien democrático que está detrás de las legítimas ganancias e impulsos, pero hay una necesidad también de regularlo. Sí.
Yes, and could I just add that when this is the greatest damage this does, it does damage to work and the dignity of work, and we talked about that. It also does damage to democracy because it enables these tech companies to assume enormous power and wealth. More than that, it depoliticizes what should be a subject for democratic debate. Now, back in the 1980s and 90s, when Tony Blair said, debating globalization, you might as well debate whether autumn should follow summer. Looking back on that time, we now see how depoliticizing was that way of presenting economic transformation. It was smug at the time when he said that, but it now almost seems quaint. He used the analogy of climate and the seasons, the weather, as if the weather is the ultimately unchangeable fact, a fact of nature. But now, 4 decades later, we know that weather and the climate, it turns out, are not fixed and unalterable after all. Climate change has reconfigured the seasons. Summer is arriving earlier and lasting longer. Some scientists tell us that unless we do something serious about climate change, by the end of the century, summer will last half the year. What this suggests is that what appears as necessary and as unalterable in one moment, what seems simply a matter of necessity beyond politics, shifts. What's necessary and what's possible, that line is itself open to political contestation and debate. The boundary between the necessary and the possible shifts under our feet. And so today we find ourselves in a circumstance where we need to consider directly this question. If we're going to contend with climate change, we have to debate as democratic citizens whether autumn will follow summer. And it's up to us. And so is the direction of technology up to us. What's disempowering is the insistence that the economy and the direction of technology are beyond human control, forces to which we have simply to adapt. But that's the ultimate source of the disempowerment we were talking about that has led to the mistrust of experts and of technocrats and of mainstream parties. And that mistrust is well placed. The problem is the mainstream parties haven't recognized this failure on their part, and they've left the way open to politicians who are exploiting this for a very dark kind of politics.
Y por eso es importante la filosofía, para plantearse, para dudar, para plantear las cuestiones que pueden resultar incómodas, para que, por ejemplo, toda la acción necesaria no sabemos si para revertir, pero sí para frenar el cambio climático, que va a tener consecuencias muy importantes, no tanto en el planeta, sino en los que habitamos este planeta, no sea una factura que acaben pagando los que siempre pagan las consecuencias de esa desigualdad. Quiero mostraros una cosa. Con el profesor Sandel hemos estado hablando al principio, y esto está indicado también en la política, en cuál es nuestra actitud ante la vida, y en un lugar posiblemente con un poco más de gente de la que hay aquí congregada. Cuando él era muy joven, esa necesidad de aprender, de cuestionar y de debatir, la llevó cuando solamente tenía 18 años y era un estudiante, a enfrentarse ni más ni menos con que el que sería más adelante presidente del gobierno de Estados Unidos, y entonces creo, Michael, que era gobernador de California. Estamos hablando, y además lo has citado en varias ocasiones, de Ronald Reagan. Me gustaría, creo que tenemos unas imágenes que podemos ver, y me gustaría que me explicaras de dónde nace con 18 años esa voluntad de debatir, de saber, de preguntar, de conocer a los protagonistas de la vida pública y de influir en ella.
I was always interested in politics from a young age. And when I was 18 in high school, I was elected the president of the student body. And I even thought at that time that maybe I would go into politics and be a politician. I didn't know for sure, but I was interested in politics. I thought either I would become a politician or maybe a political journalist. But I was in high school in California, in West Los Angeles, Pacific Palisades, California. And Ronald Reagan, the governor, was a leading figure on the right of the Republican Party. And it was clear he was going to run for president. And he lived in the district of the high school that I attended. So I thought it would be interesting to invite him for a debate. And the students in the school, we were all, none of us agreed with Ronald Reagan's politics. We were all to the left of center. And back then, we all had long hair, and we had views completely opposite to his. He was for the Vietnam War, and we were against it. He was against Social Security, and we were for it. He was against the United Nations, and we were for it. And he was against the 18-year-old vote, which was then being debated, and of course we were for it. I was a high school debater, and I thought it would be easy to debate Ronald Reagan and to show how he was wrong on all of these positions. So I invited him to come, and it's a longer story. I'll make it short. I went and my mother read in a magazine that he loved jelly beans, the candy. So I bought 6 pounds of jelly beans and put them in a box and took them to his house with an invitation. And the guards at first were suspicious what's in that box. And they searched it and they said, okay, you can take it. And 2 days later, his office said he would come. And so I prepared for the debate, and I had a list of the hardest questions I could think of, and he came. We had 2,400 students gathered in the auditorium of the school. And I challenged him, like the fierce high school debater I was. And he responded to each question with respect, with charm, with humor. He took all the questions seriously. And I realized after half an hour I hadn't made much progress in the debate. And then I asked students to ask questions, and they also asked tough questions. And he responded in a similar way. And the hour ended, and I thanked him, and we applauded, and he left, got into his limousine, went off, and we weren't really sure what had happened. He hadn't persuaded us on a single question, but he had somehow been an appealing figure. He had charmed us, and 9 years later, this ability would lead him to be elected president of the United States.
Pero eso, por ejemplo, con Trump sería imposible.
No, yeah.
Trump nunca se hubiera sentado con el presidente del club de debates del instituto para debatir, y desde luego no se habría mostrado encantador. Michael, ¿qué va a pasar en Estados Unidos? ¿Qué posibilidades tiene Kamala Harris de detener a Trump después del aprendizaje que Trump ha tenido en su primera presidencia y de todos estos años que lleva reivindicando además el odio y una sensación de venganza?
I'll come to that. Did you want to show the picture, or we don't have?
We
didn't work.
We're trying.
Okay,
Lo estamos intentando.
Okay. So, what will happen with Trump and Kamala Harris? It's 50-50 who will win. What Kamala Harris has succeeded in doing since she replaced Joe Biden as the candidate is she recovered the loss of support that resulted when Biden did very poorly in the debate. But she basically, despite the success, very real success of her campaign, her energy, her sense of joy, that enthusiasm generated a great kind of hope among Democrats, and brought back some young people who felt that Joe Biden was too old to do the job or to be effective against Trump. But it only brought her back up to where Biden had been before the debate. So it's basically a tie right now. And I think it will be very close, and it's impossible to predict. I think that there's an even chance it could go either way. And what this suggests, I mean, the obvious question is why? After he incited a riot at the U.S. Capitol when he didn't want to leave office, having lost the election. Oh, there it is. Oh, right there. Would you recognize him?
El jovencísimo, melenudo profesor Sandel, que entonces era un estudiante de 18 años debatiendo con Ronald Reagan.
But would you recognize me if you didn't know who that was?
No way.
No, you wouldn't?
No way. No.
Okay. So back to... Okay, we can take that down.
Gracias. Hemos tenido suficiente. Pero está muy bien la imagen.
Okay. Back to Trump. Yeah, it's difficult to imagine him in that setting. It's also difficult to imagine him charming anyone. But he does speak to anger. And he does speak effectively to a sense of grievance. And we've discussed how that sense of grievance, now part of his appeal, he makes a racist, xenophobic, misogynist appeal. That's true, but that's not the only reason he achieves the support that he does. And Democrats make a mistake, and this is a mistake I think that some mainstream parties make in Europe as well. They make a mistake to think it's only a matter of racism, xenophobia, and misogyny. There are legitimate grievances that are entangled with those dark sentiments that have to do with the sense of betrayal that many working people feel, especially by center-left parties. Center-left parties traditionally were the parties of working people. The Social Democratic parties of Europe, the Labour Party in Britain, the Democratic Party in the United States, going back to Franklin Roosevelt's New Deal, these were the parties that stood for the people against the powerful. And for working people against the powerful corporations and the wealthy, traditionally. But today, and in the last couple of decades, this has been reversed. the center-left parties in Europe and in Britain and the United States, by 2016, became more identified with the interests and the values and the outlook of the well-educated, college-educated professional classes than with the working class voters who once constituted their primary base of support. And instead, we saw in 2016 in the vote for Brexit, overwhelmingly those without a university degree voted to leave the European Union, and those with advanced degrees voted overwhelmingly to remain. And a few months later, the same thing happened in the election with Trump and Hillary Clinton. Trump won working class voters, and Hillary Clinton won those with advanced degrees and those in the professional classes. Now, Biden beat Trump in part because he was less identified. Biden, he came from a more modest background. He was not identified, did not think of himself as part of the meritocratic elite. He had gone to a state school. In fact, he was the first Democratic nominee for president in 36 years, Biden, without an Ivy League degree, which shows how captured the Democratic Party had become by this kind of meritocratic outlook. So he succeeded, and he started speaking about the dignity of work. Biden did. And he won just enough to get himself elected against Trump. But he didn't succeed as president. He actually was a much better president than most people expected, with a divided Congress. He enacted major legislation that moved away from the neoliberal market faith, that emphasized public investment, for example, and that represented public infrastructure investment, dealing effectively with climate change, investing in electric vehicles, in the transition to a green economy. He did a lot that his neoliberal predecessors, who were more popular, never achieved. But he was not able to translate this achievement into a new governing vision. He wasn't able to explain how this represented a movement away from the market faith that had led to the growing inequality, not only of income and wealth, but of social esteem. He couldn't articulate that effectively. And so when the inflation came, people were preoccupied with the inflation, which symbolized not only the loss of purchasing power, but also the sense that they were not in control of their destiny. However hard they worked, they could never afford really to save at the end of the week or the end of the month because prices were going up. So inflation fed the sense of disempowerment, and the sense of grievance and frustration and discontent persisted, even though inflation has come down. Now it's below 3%. But Biden was not able to translate that into a broader democratic project of renewal. And that's the challenge. It's the challenge for the Democratic Party of the United States, for the social democratic parties of Europe, to define and articulate a new governing vision that goes beyond the market faith, beyond the faith in technocratic solutions, beyond the meritocratic hubris that says the successful have succeeded on their own, that their success is their own doing, and that reconnects with working people and with the struggles people face every day, and also that reconnects with the aspiration for a sense of belonging, a sense that we are in this together, a deeper sense of national community. The center-left makes a mistake to leave patriotism and national cohesion and a sense of belonging to right-wing politicians who will exploit it for their purposes. This is what we are waiting for a new democratic vision in Europe and in the United States.
El desafío allí y aquí, efectivamente. Michael, la política se perdió a un gran personaje, porque Michael Sandel, si hubiera continuado con su carrera, claramente tiene el gusto, el radar, el pulso, pero la filosofía y los ciudadanos hemos ganado mucho con esa reflexión profunda sobre la sociedad, sobre el bien común, sobre hacia dónde vamos y hacia dónde tenemos que aspirar como ciudadanos. Ha sido un inmenso placer estar aquí contigo esta tarde y cerrar este Festival de las Ideas. Muchísimas gracias, Michael. Muy buenas noches.
Thank you so much. Thank you, Marcel. Thank you. Thank you. Thank you.